Welcome to Thunga's Story Time, where history's most fascinating stories come alive. Today, we're diving into the incredible rise of Catherine the Great, a woman who started as a little-known German princess and went on to become one of Russia's most powerful and legendary rulers. Her journey is filled with secrets, palace intrigues, daring coups, and a fight to hold power in a world ruled by men. Stay tuned as we uncover how Catherine not only seized the throne but reshaped an empire and left a legacy that still echoes today. Ready for a story of ambition, power, and sheer determination? Let's jump right in. Catherine the Great, background and early ambitions. Catherine the Great, originally born as Sophie Friederike August von Anhalt-Zerbst, came into the world on May 2, 1729, in the small principality of Anhalt-Zerbst, located in what is now modern-day Germany. Her beginnings were relatively modest by royal standards. She was the daughter of a minor German prince and his wife, a family not particularly prominent in the European royal hierarchy. Yet, Sophie was anything but ordinary. Even from a young age, she showed a remarkable intelligence and a fierce ambition that would eventually reshape one of the greatest empires in the world. Her childhood was spent in a relatively quiet and provincial environment, far removed from the bustling courts of Europe's major powers. However, Sophie's education was thorough and progressive for the time, especially for a girl. Her mother ensured she was well versed in multiple languages, including French, German, and Russian, as well as in philosophy, history, and the arts. These studies sparked a lifelong love for learning and an admiration for the Enlightenment thinkers who emphasized reason, progress, and reform. Sophie's personal ambitions were shaped by this early education and the limited opportunities afforded to a minor princess in the fragmented political landscape of 18th-century Europe. At the time, marriage was one of the few paths through which women of her station could wield influence or power. And so, her sharp mind and keen social skills positioned her to navigate the intricate webs of royal politics that would soon bring her far from her German roots. Her life took a dramatic turn when she was selected to marry the heir to the Russian throne, Grand Duke Peter of Holstein-Gottorp, who would later become Peter III of Russia. This was no small opportunity. Russia, vast and powerful but often seen as backward and barbaric by Western Europeans, was a world away from Sophie's small German principality. Accepting this marriage proposal was an act of courage and vision. It meant leaving behind everything familiar, the language, the culture, her family, and stepping into a foreign land where intrigue and danger lurked around every corner. Before the marriage, Sophie underwent a profound transformation. She converted from Lutheranism to Russian Orthodoxy, taking on the name Ekaterina Alexeyevna, known to history as Catherine. This change was more than a religious formality, it symbolized her commitment to embrace and immerse herself in Russian culture and society. She worked tirelessly to master the Russian language and to understand the customs, politics, and traditions of her new homeland. She knew that if she were to survive, and thrive, in the Russian court, she needed to be more than just a foreign princess married to the heir apparent, she needed to become a true Russian. Despite these efforts, the marriage to Peter was deeply troubled. Peter was immature, erratic, and ill-suited for leadership, lacking the charisma and political acumen needed to win the loyalty of his people and the respect of the nobility. Their personal relationship was cold and distant, marked by mutual distrust and conflict. The Russian court itself was a perilous environment, rife with conspiracies and factional rivalries. For Catherine, this meant that survival required not only intelligence but also a great deal of political savvy and strategic thinking. Rather than resign herself to a powerless existence, Catherine began quietly building her own base of influence. She cultivated relationships with powerful nobles and military leaders, earning their respect through her intellect, charm, and unwavering determination. She read extensively, particularly works associated with the Enlightenment, a philosophical movement advocating reason, progress, and the reform of society and government. This exposure helped her develop a vision for Russia's future, one that combined modernization with strong centralized rule. Catherine's ambitions were not limited to personal survival or status, she wanted to transform Russia itself. She dreamed of making the empire a beacon of culture, education, and power, on par with the great nations of Western Europe. This grand vision set the stage for what would become one of the most remarkable reigns in Russian history. The stage was set for a dramatic turn of events. When Peter III ascended the throne in 1762, his unpopularity with the army and nobility provided Catherine with an opening. Leveraging the alliances she had nurtured and capitalizing on widespread discontent with Peter's erratic rule, Catherine orchestrated a coup d'état that would remove her husband from power and install herself as the new ruler of Russia. This nearly bloodless takeover was the culmination of years of careful planning, bold ambition, and a keen understanding of power dynamics. Her rise from a minor German princess to Empress of Russia is a testament to her extraordinary intelligence, resilience, and political skill. Catherine the Great's background and early ambitions not only shaped her personal destiny but also altered the course of Russian and European history forever. Catherine the Great, arrival in Russia and adaptation. When Sophie Friederike August von Anhalt-Zerbst first stepped onto Russian soil in 1744, she was just 14 years old. The journey from her small German principality to the vast empire of Russia was not only a physical relocation, but also the beginning of one of history's most dramatic transformations. What began as a dynastic marriage arrangement would evolve into a calculated and fearless reinvention. Sophie would soon become Catherine, and the empire she entered as a foreigner would become the one she ruled with unmatched force and vision. Sophie's engagement to Crown Prince Peter of Russia, the heir to Empress Elizabeth, was a strategic match. Peter was also of German descent and the grandson of Peter the Great, though he was born in Kiel and raised in the strict and often cold courts of Northern Europe. For Empress Elizabeth, the choice of Sophie was both practical and political. She was Protestant, and therefore eligible to convert easily, had noble blood, and was young enough to mold into a proper Russian consort. However, to truly become a part of the Russian royal family, Sophie had to change nearly everything about herself. She knew this from the moment she arrived. Her first challenge was religious conversion, a deeply symbolic act in a society where orthodoxy was more than just faith, it was an expression of national identity and divine rule. Sophie converted to Eastern Orthodoxy in a public ceremony, choosing the name Ekaterina Alexeyevna, or Catherine. The act was more than ceremonial. It marked her first step in shedding her old self and assuming a new identity designed for the Russian court and, eventually, the Russian people. Catherine did not treat her new role passively. Rather than accept the position of a foreign bride waiting in the wings, she took a proactive and almost obsessive interest in adapting to her new home. She learned the Russian language with intensity, practicing day and night until she could speak fluently. Her goal was not just to communicate, but to belong. While her husband-to-be showed little interest in Russia or its people, speaking German at court, dressing in Prussian uniforms, and idealizing the military culture of Frederick the Great, Catherine was doing the opposite. She immersed herself in Russian history, customs, and literature. This wasn't merely about pleasing Empress Elizabeth or meeting the expectations of the court. Catherine had already begun to understand something deeper, that power in Russia was rooted in perception. To rule, she would one day need the love, or at least the loyalty, of the Russian people and their institutions. If she was to rise in such a foreign and often hostile environment, she couldn't be seen as a German princess living in exile. She had to become, in every visible way, Russian. Her effort to become Russian also involved mastering the art of Russian court etiquette, which was both elaborate and politically dangerous. Court life under Empress Elizabeth was luxurious but fraught with intrigue, vanity, and power games. Catherine watched and listened. She studied not just languages, but people, their alliances, their ambitions, and their weaknesses. Over time, she gained the respect of courtiers and nobles, many of whom were impressed by her dedication and natural charisma. One of the key figures in her adaptation was Empress Elizabeth herself, a powerful and often temperamental ruler who had seized the throne in a coup and understood better than anyone the cost of ambition in Russia. Elizabeth was notoriously protective of her throne and her nephew Peter, yet she was also impressed by Catherine's intelligence and ability to navigate court life without scandal. The Empress insisted on Catherine's health, education, and appearance being constantly monitored. It was a double-edged sword. Catherine was closely guarded, but she was also being groomed, perhaps unintentionally, for greatness. In contrast, her relationship with her fiancé Peter was cold and awkward from the beginning. Peter was immature, often cruel, and entirely uninterested in his future bride. He idolized Prussia and showed little regard for Russian customs, which made him unpopular with the court and the military. Catherine, ever observant, began to sense that Peter's unpopularity could be an opportunity. While he distanced himself from Russia, she was building a reputation as a dutiful, intelligent, and capable potential consort. Behind the scenes, Catherine was also forming alliances, not through overt power plays, but through conversations, kindness, and quiet political networking. Her personal charm and intellectual curiosity earned her the favor of influential figures, including military leaders, statesmen, and fellow nobles. She wrote later in her memoirs that she often felt alone in Russia, surrounded by rivals and danger, but that solitude only deepened her resolve. She was already planning for a future far beyond that of a mere queen consort. Catherine's adaptation to Russian life was an extraordinary feat. In less than a decade, she went from being an obscure teenager in a foreign country to a woman prepared to take the reins of one of the most complex and powerful nations in the world. She had mastered the language, embraced the faith, understood the culture, and positioned herself as more Russian than many born into nobility. Her transformation was not just political, it was personal. Catherine fell in love with Russia, not blindly, but strategically and emotionally. She believed in its potential. Even though the country she entered was riddled with corruption, inefficiency, and backwardness compared to Western Europe, she saw not decay but opportunity. Russia, in her eyes, was a sleeping giant, and she was determined to be the one to awaken it. What made Catherine's early years in Russia so remarkable wasn't just her ability to adapt, but the clarity of her vision even at a young age. While many young brides would have been content to survive the court and play their ceremonial role, Catherine was already looking beyond the throne room. She was preparing to rule, not as a foreign queen, but as a true Russian empress. Catherine the Great, unhappy marriage and dangerous court. Despite her tireless efforts to adapt and thrive in Russia, Catherine soon found herself trapped in a deeply unhappy marriage that would test her resilience, intelligence, and survival instincts. Her union with Grand Duke Peter, arranged more for dynastic politics than compatibility, was a cold and turbulent affair. While Catherine transformed herself into a model Russian duchess, intelligent, poised, and culturally immersed, Peter remained emotionally stunted and politically tone-deaf. Peter was never meant to be a ruler in the mold of Peter the Great, despite being his grandson. He was immature, erratic, and painfully insecure. Raised in the militaristic and Protestant courts of Prussia, Peter idolized Frederick the Great and openly disdained Russian customs, traditions, and even its people. He preferred to dress in Prussian military uniforms, played with toy soldiers well into adulthood, and showed little interest in affairs of state or his wife. Catherine once wrote that he spent more time with his dolls and his dog than with her. The lack of affection between the two was no secret. Their personalities clashed completely. Catherine was introspective, strategic, and keenly aware of public perception. Peter was childish, impulsive, and socially inept. He mocked Russian orthodoxy, drank excessively, and often humiliated Catherine in public. Their private life was even more dysfunctional. Years passed without consummation, leading to speculation and whispers at court. It was a humiliation for Catherine, but one she would turn to her advantage in time. Worse than the personal humiliation was the atmosphere of constant political danger. The Russian imperial court under Empress Elizabeth was a glittering world of ballrooms and banquets, but beneath the surface it was a battlefield of hidden daggers, rival factions, and shifting alliances. For a foreign-born duchess like Catherine, young, childless, and married to a man rapidly losing favor, every step had to be calculated with precision. Suspicion constantly hovered over her. Some at court never trusted her as a true Russian, viewing her German heritage as a liability, especially during times of tension with Prussia. Her intelligence made her even more threatening. Catherine's habit of reading French Enlightenment thinkers, Voltaire, Montesquieu, and later, Rousseau, raised eyebrows among conservative courtiers. But she didn't stop. She read in secret, often by candlelight, long after everyone else had gone to sleep. These ideas planted the seeds of reform that would one day define her reign. Catherine also began forming quiet relationships outside of her marriage, intellectual, emotional, and eventually romantic. These were not the reckless affairs of an impulsive woman, but the deliberate, often strategic bonds of someone who understood that influence in the Russian court could not come from her title alone. Her most important early ally was Sergei Saltykov, a courtier who not only gave her companionship but also introduced her to powerful members of the nobility. Later, her relationships with figures like Gregory Orlov and eventually Gregory Potemkin would become central to both her personal and political power. Still, danger surrounded her. Catherine lived every day under the shadow of failure. She had no child for many years, an enormous liability in a royal household obsessed with succession. Rumors circulated that Peter might repudiate her and marry someone else. If that happened, Catherine would likely be exiled to a convent, or worse. She knew that her future, her very survival, depended on producing an heir and building alliances of her own. The turning point came in 1754 with the birth of her son, Paul. Although officially recognized as the son of Peter, many believed he was the child of Catherine's lover. Regardless of the truth, the birth secured her place at court, temporarily. The child was immediately taken from her by Empress Elizabeth, who raised Paul herself, allowing Catherine only limited access. It was another cruel twist in a life already shaped by isolation, betrayal, and political calculation. Meanwhile, Peter's behavior grew more erratic. His open admiration of Prussia made him deeply unpopular during the 7 Years' War, when Russia was at war with Frederick the Great. Many nobles and military officers began to look at Catherine, already admired for her poise and intelligence, as a potential alternative. She had no formal power, but she had the one thing that mattered more: credibility. People trusted her judgment, and more importantly, they believed she cared about Russia. Catherine was careful not to act too soon. For years, she lived in a kind of suspended tension, watching, waiting, calculating. She made herself indispensable to key figures in the military, the court, and the Orthodox Church. She spoke to foreign ambassadors, quietly building her diplomatic credibility. She studied Russian history, legal codes, and military strategy. All the while, She wore the mask of the obedient wife and duchess, careful not to give Peter or his allies any reason to strike first. And then, in 1762, her moment arrived. When Empress Elizabeth died in early 1762, Peter ascended the throne as Peter III. Almost immediately, his reign proved catastrophic. He alienated the church, insulted the army, and issued decrees that seemed more Prussian than Russian. His enemies multiplied quickly. Catherine knew that the window to act was narrow and closing fast. Within 6 months of his coronation, Catherine, backed by the imperial guard, key military leaders, and many nobles, executed a nearly bloodless coup d'état. Peter was arrested, forced to abdicate, and soon died under mysterious circumstances while in custody. At age 33, Catherine was declared Empress of Russia. But long before she wore the crown, Catherine had already proven her greatest strength, survival. In a court riddled with enemies, betrayal, and humiliation, she never broke. She never stopped learning, never stopped preparing. She took every slight, every setback, every whispered rumor, and turned them into fuel. Her unhappy marriage and life at court did not crush her. They forged her into one of the most powerful rulers in history. Catherine the Great, preparing to seize power. After years of enduring a loveless marriage and surviving the treacherous intrigues of the Russian court, Catherine understood one fundamental truth: power was not given, it had to be taken. Her husband Peter, now Emperor Peter III, had finally ascended the throne in 1762 following the death of his aunt, Empress Elizabeth. But instead of seizing his moment, Peter squandered it. His reign began with clumsy, tone-deaf decisions that infuriated the very people he needed most: nobles, the military, and the church. For Catherine, it was confirmation of everything she had patiently waited for. While Peter blundered, Catherine moved with quiet precision. Long before Peter took the throne, she had begun laying the groundwork for her own path to power. It was a plan built not on impulse, but on years of observation, alliance building, and careful self-reinvention. From her earliest days at court, Catherine had recognized the key players in Russia's complex political structure: the Guards regiments who held real military power, the influential noble families whose support could legitimize or destroy a ruler, and the church, which gave the crown spiritual authority. She courted each of these groups with subtlety and skill, often behind closed doors, far from the grand ballrooms and public pageantry. She established particularly close ties with the Imperial Guard, the elite military units responsible for the security of the throne. Many of its officers admired Catherine's intelligence and poise, especially in contrast to Peter's erratic and foreign-leaning behavior. Her most important relationship in this arena was with Gregory Orlov, a charismatic Guards officer who would become both her lover and co-conspirator. Through Orlov and his brothers, Catherine gained access to the command structure of the very force that would one day raise her to power. Catherine also knew that influence without vision was hollow. In private, she immersed herself in the writings of the French Enlightenment, Voltaire, Diderot, Montesquieu, absorbing ideas about governance, education, justice, and the role of the monarch. Unlike Peter, who admired the Enlightenment superficially but failed to understand its spirit, Catherine internalized its values. She began to imagine a Russia that was not just powerful but enlightened, a modern empire rooted in law, reason, and progress. This wasn't mere idealism, it was a carefully crafted political identity that would distinguish her from the chaos surrounding Peter's reign. Her reading also served another purpose. Catherine was not Russian by birth, but she intended to become more Russian than the Russians. By engaging with both Western philosophy and Russian history, she sought to become a ruler who could bridge tradition and reform. She studied Peter the Great's reforms, the legal codes of the empire, and the Orthodox Church's structure. She listened to officials, clergy, and commoners alike, building a nuanced understanding of the empire's vast, diverse challenges. Peter, meanwhile, gave her every advantage. Obsessed with his idol Frederick the Great, he pulled Russia out of the 7 Years' War against Prussia, an unpopular move seen by many as a betrayal of Russian honor and sacrifice. He further alienated the Orthodox Church by seizing monastic lands. He even threatened to move the capital from St. Petersburg to his native Holstein, in what seemed like a bizarre rejection of Russian identity altogether. At court, Peter's arrogance grew. He dismissed seasoned advisors and surrounded himself with German favorites. He openly insulted Catherine, belittled her intelligence, and hinted that he might divorce her. Catherine, for her part, kept quiet. She smiled, nodded, and said little in public, waiting, watching, and calculating. By spring of 1762, the situation was ripe. Catherine had the support of key regiments, allies within the nobility, and sympathetic clergy. Most importantly, she had public opinion on her side. To many Russians, she embodied dignity, stability, and loyalty to the nation, qualities her husband clearly lacked. And behind the scenes, she had already secured a promise from the Orlov brothers and their military allies: when the time came, they would act. The final spark came in July. Rumors reached Catherine that Peter was preparing to have her arrested, perhaps even sent to a convent or executed. Whether these rumors were true or part of the propaganda that followed is still debated, but for Catherine, they were motivation enough. She knew the coup had to happen now, or never. On the morning of July 9, 1762, Catherine made her move. She rode to the Izmailovsky Regiment barracks, dressed in military uniform and flanked by loyal officers. There, she was hailed as Empress Catherine II by soldiers who had sworn allegiance to her. She then rode to other regiments, gathering support and momentum with each stop. The coup had begun, not with violence, but with calculated symbolism and a powerful show of loyalty. By midday, Catherine entered the Kazan Cathedral, where she was formally blessed and declared sovereign. Later that evening, Peter was captured and forced to abdicate. He would die in custody days later under suspicious circumstances, another grim echo of court politics, though Catherine denied any involvement. Just like that, Catherine had seized power. But unlike her predecessors, she had done so not through bloodshed or brute force, but through a deep understanding of her country's power structure, strategic alliances, and a compelling vision for a better Russia. She was now Empress of all the Russias, but her real work was only just beginning. Catherine the Great, coup and ascension to the throne. By the summer of 1762, the tension at the Russian court had become almost unbearable. Catherine, wife of Emperor Peter III, had spent nearly 2 decades navigating a volatile world of imperial politics, palace intrigue, and personal humiliation. But now, after years of calculated planning, she was ready to make her move. Her husband, Peter III, had only been on the throne for 6 months, but in that short time, he had managed to alienate almost every key institution in the empire. He had withdrawn Russian troops from the 7 Years' War and made peace with Prussia, a deeply unpopular move among both the military and the nobility, many of whom had lost sons and fortunes in the conflict. He insulted the Orthodox Church by seizing church lands and stripping away long-held privileges. He threatened to relocate the imperial capital to his native Holstein. And he surrounded himself with German advisors, treating Russia as a place he barely tolerated rather than ruled with affection. The common people disliked him. The nobility distrusted him. The clergy condemned him. And within the walls of the Winter Palace, his own wife was preparing to take his place. For Catherine, the opportunity was clear. Years earlier, she had quietly secured the loyalty of the military, formed bonds with influential noble families, and cultivated the image of a calm, intelligent, Russian-loving woman, everything Peter was not. With her allies in place and public opinion shifting in her favor, the moment had come. The final push came when she received word, perhaps rumor, perhaps fact, that Peter intended to have her arrested, possibly even divorced or exiled. She could no longer afford to wait. If she hesitated, she might lose everything. It was now or never. On the night of July 8, 1762, Catherine was woken in the early hours by her loyal ally Gregory Orlov. The coup was underway. She dressed not in royal gowns, but in a modest riding outfit and set off toward the barracks of the Izmailovsky Regiment, a unit fiercely loyal to her. There, in front of armed soldiers, she made her claim. Peter was unfit to rule, and the fate of Russia now depended on her. The soldiers, many of whom had already been swayed by the Orlov brothers, immediately swore allegiance. Catherine was now, at least in spirit, Empress of Russia. But it wouldn't end there. Catherine then rode from regiment to regiment across St. Petersburg. With every stop, she gathered more support. The Preobrazhensky, Semyonovsky, and Horse Guards all declared for her. Soldiers knelt and kissed her hand. Civilians cheered her name. Priests offered blessings. And finally, at Kazan Cathedral, the sacred rite was performed. Catherine was anointed and formally declared Empress Catherine II. It was, in every sense, a bloodless revolution. Peter, meanwhile, was at his summer palace in Oranienbaum, completely unaware of what was happening. When news of Catherine's declaration reached him, he panicked. Without widespread military support, without the loyalty of the church or nobility, Peter had few options. He attempted to flee but was intercepted. Within days, he signed a formal abdication, stating, "I am sorry for what I have done." A week later, Peter was dead, officially from a severe attack of hemorrhoidal colic, though many historians believe he was murdered, likely with the quiet approval of Catherine's inner circle. Whether she ordered it or simply allowed it remains one of history's unanswered questions. In any case, the threat was gone. Catherine, still only in her early 30s, was now the sole ruler of one of the largest empires on earth. Her rise to power was unprecedented. Never before had a woman, born in a foreign land, seized the Russian throne with such precision, such grace, and such overwhelming support. And yet, the enormity of her achievement was matched by the weight of what came next. She knew she had to legitimize her rule quickly. A female monarch, especially one who had overthrown her husband, was a rarity, and Catherine needed to prove that she wasn't merely a usurper, but a rightful sovereign. She kept Peter's death quiet, refused to speak ill of him in public, and emphasized continuity over rupture. She kept many of his reforms, if only temporarily, and went out of her way to show respect to traditional Russian institutions. Her coronation was held in Moscow in September of that year. Wearing the great imperial crown, encrusted with diamonds and topped with a massive red spinel, Catherine stood beneath the golden dome of the Assumption Cathedral and accepted the symbols of Russian sovereignty, the scepter, the orb, and the mantle of Mink-Leinderman. The image was powerful, almost mythic. A woman once dismissed as a German outsider now stood as the embodiment of Russian power and resilience. But behind the ceremonial splendor, Catherine knew that her real work had just begun. She had taken the throne with soldiers, charisma, and timing. Now she would have to rule with vision, diplomacy, and an iron will. Russia was an empire of vast contradictions, noble wealth and peasant poverty, European ideas and Asiatic traditions, Orthodox mysticism and Enlightenment reason. To succeed, Catherine would have to navigate all of it, and she intended to. Catherine the Great, Enlightenment on the throne. When Catherine II took the Russian throne in 1762, she didn't just inherit a vast empire, she inherited centuries of autocratic rule, feudal divisions, and a society deeply resistant to change. But Catherine had no intention of being merely a caretaker of the past. She saw herself as a ruler of vision, not tradition, a philosopher on the throne. Long before her coup against Peter III, Catherine had already immersed herself in the writings of Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire, Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Diderot. These men, despite living in France or Switzerland, had become her intellectual companions. Their ideas about reason, liberty, justice, and governance shaped how she saw Russia's future. To many of her contemporaries, this was shocking. The ruler of one of the world's most autocratic regimes was also its most vocal champion of liberal thought. Catherine believed in enlightened absolutism, the idea that a monarch could use unchecked power to promote rational reform. It was a contradiction on paper, but for Catherine, it was a blueprint. She didn't want to overthrow the monarchy or dismantle the aristocracy. Instead, she wanted to civilize it, refine it, and modernize it from the top down. One of her first major acts was the creation of the Nakas, or Instruction, in 1767, a sweeping document that was meant to serve as the foundation for a new legal code. Inspired heavily by Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws, the Nakas called for equality before the law, the abolition of torture, and the humane treatment of prisoners. It criticized capital punishment and emphasized the importance of a rational legal system. To spread and support this initiative, Catherine assembled a legislative commission composed of representatives from all segments of Russian society, nobles, townspeople, Cossacks, and even peasants. This was revolutionary. It was one of the first times in Russian history that such a broad cross-section of people were invited to discuss national policy. However, despite the lofty ideals, the commission faltered. Conservative nobles resisted any talk of reform, especially if it threatened their power or land holdings. The sheer diversity of the delegates, geographically, culturally, and socially, made consensus nearly impossible. The commission was eventually dissolved without producing a new legal code. Still, Catherine had made a clear statement: Russia would not stay frozen in time. Her Enlightenment ambitions extended well beyond law. Education was another pillar of her reformist agenda. Catherine was appalled at Russia's lack of public schools. At the time, most education was reserved for the elite and controlled by the church. In 1786, she introduced the Statute of National Education, which established a system of state-run, secular primary and secondary schools across the empire. These schools were modeled on Enlightenment ideals, teaching not just religion, but science, mathematics, literature, and moral philosophy. She also established the Smolny Institute for Noble Maidens, the first state-financed higher education institution for women in Europe. For Catherine, education was not just a social good, it was a national necessity. She believed an educated population would be a more loyal, more productive, and more civilized one. Her admiration for Enlightenment thinkers wasn't limited to reading their books, she befriended many of them. She maintained a 15-year correspondence with Voltaire, who praised her as the embodiment of a philosopher queen. She purchased Diderot's library when he fell into financial trouble and invited him to St. Petersburg, even paying him a generous pension. Their conversations were famously long and lively, filled with debates about freedom, governance, and the fate of empires. And yet, Catherine was no starry-eyed idealist. She was a realist. While she celebrated Enlightenment principles in theory, she was careful in how she applied them. She knew that too much reform, too fast, could spark unrest, or worse, rebellion. Nowhere was this tension more apparent than in her approach to serfdom. Catherine hated serfdom in principle. She once called it a despicable practice and dreamed of gradually phasing it out. But in practice, she expanded it. As a reward for loyalty, she granted more land, and more serfs, to the nobility. She feared that any serious attempt to free the serfs would provoke the aristocracy and destabilize the empire. She was probably right. It was a painful compromise. For all her Enlightenment rhetoric, Catherine ultimately sided with the elite over the enslaved. And that contradiction would haunt her legacy. Still, her reforms reshaped Russia in real ways. She reorganized provincial government, creating 50 provinces each with its own bureaucracy to better administer local affairs. She promoted trade and founded new towns. She supported the arts and sciences, founding the Russian Academy of Sciences and funding expeditions to explore the far reaches of the empire. She even sponsored the first Russian dictionary. Her court became a beacon of sophistication. French was spoken more often than Russian. Classical music, ballet, and painting flourished. The Hermitage Museum, which began as her private art collection, became a cultural treasure, filled with works by Rembrandt, Rubens, and Raphael. Yet Catherine never forgot the delicate line she was walking. She ruled over a land where illiteracy was widespread, roads were few, and winters were long. Reform had to be balanced with control. Progress with tradition. Enlightenment with autocracy. By the end of the 1770s, she had done more than any Russian monarch before her to modernize the empire. She had made Russia more literate, more administratively coherent, and more internationally respected. But she also cemented her power as an absolute monarch. Catherine had become the Enlightenment's paradox, a ruler who believed in liberty, but governed with force, who praised equality, but expanded serfdom, who loved philosophers, but trusted soldiers. And she wasn't finished yet. Catherine the Great, Empire on the March. While Catherine II was deeply influenced by Enlightenment philosophy and internal reform, she never lost sight of an older, more imperial ambition, to make Russia bigger, stronger, and more dominant on the world stage. For Catherine, the greatness of an empire wasn't just measured by ideas or laws, it was measured by land, access to the seas, and influence beyond its borders. She understood that in 18th-century Europe, power flowed not only from palaces and parliaments, but also from armies and conquests. And Catherine wielded both with remarkable precision. One of her primary geopolitical goals was access to warm water ports, harbors that didn't freeze over in winter and allowed for year-round trade and naval activity. Russia, though vast, was largely landlocked or reliant on frozen seas. The key to economic and military vitality, she believed, lay to the south, in the Black Sea, which meant facing off against the powerful Ottoman Empire. Russia and the Ottomans had clashed for centuries. But Catherine's campaigns were on a new scale. In 1768, just 6 years after her ascent to the throne, Russia entered into the Russo-Turkish War, 1768 to 1774. At the time, the Ottoman Empire still held vast territories across Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and the Balkans. But its power was waning. Catherine seized the opportunity to push Russia's southern frontier further than it had ever reached. The war was long and brutal, but ultimately a triumph for Russia. Under the leadership of brilliant generals like Alexander Suvorov and Gregory Potemkin, who was also one of Catherine's closest confidants and lovers, the Russian military delivered blow after blow to Ottoman forces. Naval victories, especially the Battle of Chesme in 1770, signaled the rise of Russian maritime might. The resulting Treaty of Kusak-Kanerka in 1774 was a diplomatic earthquake. Russia gained control over key territories in the northern Black Sea region, won the right to protect Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire, and, most crucially, secured access to warm water ports in Crimea. This changed everything. Catherine wasn't satisfied. In the years that followed, she consolidated her grip over the region. In 1783, Russia formally annexed Crimea, ending centuries of Tatar rule and permanently weakening Ottoman influence. This not only gave Russia a stronger foothold on the Black Sea, it sent a message to Europe: Russia was no longer a backward empire. It was a rising power. As her armies advanced, so did her vision. Catherine had a knack for pairing military conquest with imperial theater. She commissioned Potemkin to build new cities in the south: Odessa, Kherson, Sevastopol, often in desolate regions. These towns would become vital military and trading centers, fueling Russia's economic transformation. In 1787, to celebrate the successes in the south, Catherine embarked on a grand tour of her new territories, traveling by barge down the Dnieper River with foreign dignitaries in tow, including the Austrian Emperor Joseph II. The journey was lavish and symbolic, meant to dazzle Europe with Russia's reach and Catherine's glory. This trip would give rise to the legend of the Potemkin villages, supposedly fake, facade-only towns constructed to impress the empress. Whether these stories were true or exaggerated, the message was clear: Catherine ruled an empire of ambition and spectacle. Meanwhile, to the west, another opportunity was unfolding: the gradual dismemberment of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Poland at the time was politically fragmented and militarily weak, a tempting prize for its more powerful neighbors, Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Rather than go to war with each other, the three powers agreed to a strategy that would shock Europe: partition the country piece by piece. Catherine played a leading role in all three partitions of Poland, 1772, 1793, and 1795. Her justification was always clothed in Enlightenment language: restoring order, protecting minorities, promoting stability. But the reality was simple: Russia was absorbing a massive swath of Eastern Europe. By the final partition, Poland ceased to exist as an independent nation. These moves were strategic, not just territorial. By expanding westward into Poland and southward into the Black Sea, Catherine changed Russia's geographic, cultural, and political identity. No longer just a northern giant, Russia had become a multi-front empire, European, Slavic, Orthodox, and increasingly global. Her military wasn't just about conquest. Catherine invested heavily in reforming the Russian army and navy, bringing in foreign officers to modernize training and tactics. She built up shipyards and ports, ensuring Russia could project power across seas as well as land. But expansion had its costs. Conquering territory meant ruling over new, often unwilling, populations, Crimean Tatars, Poles, Jews, Armenians, and more. Catherine's policies toward these groups varied. Sometimes she allowed religious and cultural autonomy, other times, she imposed Russification. As the empire grew, so did the challenge of keeping it stable, united, and loyal. And of course, the constant wars drained resources and deepened inequality. Taxes rose. The burden on serfs grew heavier. Catherine's Enlightenment dreams often took a backseat to military realities. Yet her success was undeniable. Under her rule, Russia's territory expanded by over 200,000 square miles. She had not only added lands, she had redefined what Russia could be. From a cold, inward-facing empire, it had become a formidable force from the Baltic to the Black Sea. By the end of the 1790s, Catherine had turned Russia into the dominant power in Eastern Europe, rivaled only by the Habsburgs and the Prussians. Her empire was sprawling, her armies feared, her navy respected. She had fulfilled Peter the Great's vision, and in many ways, surpassed it. Catherine the Great wasn't just a philosopher queen. She was a conqueror, a strategist, and a nation builder. The Enlightenment gave her a vocabulary of justice and progress, but it was the battlefield, the treaty table, and the map that cemented her legacy. And the world would never look at Russia the same way again. Catherine the Great, power and passion. As Catherine the Great expanded the Russian Empire across continents and reshaped its legal and cultural landscape, her private life became one of the most talked about, and misunderstood, aspects of her reign. Few monarchs in history have had their personal affairs as scrutinized or as sensationalized. Yet, far from weakening her rule, Catherine's romantic relationships often strengthened her grip on power, revealing a woman who knew how to navigate both the bedroom and the battlefield with strategic precision. Catherine's marriage to Peter III had been a cold, political union from the start. Devoid of affection or respect, their relationship turned Catherine inward, driving her toward intellectual pursuits, and eventually toward more emotionally and politically rewarding liaisons. After Peter's deposition and her rise to power in 1762, she was no longer confined by the expectations of an unhappy royal marriage. As empress, she was free to choose her partners, and she did so with intelligence and intention. Over the course of her reign, Catherine had a series of lovers, more than a dozen by most historical accounts. But these were not idle flings. Many of these men served as advisors, confidants, and aides-de-camp. Their influence extended well beyond the palace chambers. Catherine, shrewd and emotionally perceptive, often chose men who were young, ambitious, and politically capable. In return, they offered her loyalty, companionship, and often, valuable service to the empire. The most notable and enduring of these relationships was with Gregory Potemkin. Potemkin was no ordinary courtier. A brilliant military commander, statesman, and empire builder, he was instrumental in Russia's conquest and consolidation of Crimea. Their relationship began in the early 1770s, likely after the conclusion of the Russo-Turkish War, and it blossomed quickly, intellectually, emotionally, and physically. Some believe the two may have even secretly married, though no official record exists. What made their partnership so extraordinary was its fusion of love and statecraft. Potemkin wasn't just a romantic companion, he was Catherine's partner in empire. She trusted him with vast powers, appointing him governor-general of newly acquired southern territories and entrusting him with military and diplomatic missions of immense importance. The pair shared a common vision of imperial grandeur. Potemkin helped orchestrate the expansion and development of cities like Sevastopol and Odessa, turning the once desolate steppe into bustling centers of trade and naval power. He was flamboyant, visionary, and at times erratic, but Catherine embraced his brilliance. Their letters to each other are filled with passion, humor, and the language of equals, a testament to their unusual and intimate bond. Even after their romantic relationship cooled, their partnership endured. Potemkin remained one of Catherine's most trusted advisors until his death in 1791. When he passed, Catherine was heartbroken. She had lost not just a lover, but a co-architect of her empire. But Potemkin was not the only man in her life. After him came a series of younger favorites, often referred to as official lovers. These men, Alexander Lonskoy, Ivan Rimsky-Korsakov, Platon Zubov, among others, were often installed with generous pensions, estates, and titles. Critics saw these affairs as signs of indulgence or impropriety. But Catherine treated them like appointments in her personal court. Each served a role, for a time, and when the relationship ended, it often did so on amicable terms. To the outside world, especially in conservative European courts, Catherine's romantic independence was scandalous. She was a woman, ruling alone, openly taking lovers, and still commanding armies, enacting reforms, and expanding borders. Rumors about her personal life ran wild. Pamphlets in Western Europe portrayed her as a nymphomaniac or tyrant. French satirists and British tabloids alike delighted in portraying her as a woman ruled by her passions rather than her policies. But these portrayals were both misogynistic and misleading. What Catherine demonstrated, in fact, was a revolutionary model of feminine power. She refused to be bound by the double standards of royal decorum. Where male monarchs were expected to have mistresses and illegitimate children, Catherine was condemned for doing the same. She defied that hypocrisy with poise. Importantly, her personal life never interfered with her governance. If anything, her emotional relationships gave her space to reflect, recharge, and find companionship in the isolating world of imperial leadership. She did not marry again, not because she was incapable of love, but because she was unwilling to share power or legitimacy with another monarch. Her court, at times, functioned like a hybrid of state and salon, where lovers might mingle with philosophers, artists, and generals. It was as much a place of policy as of poetry. Catherine maintained a sense of control in all these relationships. She was never manipulated or ruled by her passions. Even her alleged favorites were kept on a short political leash. This ability to balance private passion with public authority is what truly set her apart. Catherine did not apologize for being a woman of desire, but neither did she let her desires cloud her judgment. Her romantic life, if anything, demonstrated her independence, her sense of personal freedom, and her command over her own narrative. In the end, what mattered wasn't how many lovers she had. It was how none of them eclipsed her. Catherine remained the sole ruler of Russia, in title and in spirit. Her charisma, her intellect, and her political genius kept the empire, and her legacy, firmly under her control. Today, historians are beginning to reframe Catherine's personal life not as scandal but as sovereignty. She navigated love like she did politics, with care, calculation, and occasional daring. And in doing so, she shattered the mold of what a female ruler could be. Catherine the Great was not just an empress. She was a woman who lived boldly, in public, in private, and in history. Catherine the Great, the fires of rebellion. By the early 1770s, Catherine the Great had achieved what few monarchs ever could. She had seized the throne of the Russian Empire in a nearly bloodless coup, implemented Enlightenment-inspired reforms, and dramatically expanded her empire's territory and influence. But even as she built palaces and corresponded with Voltaire, the ground beneath her empire was starting to shake. That tremor would soon erupt into a full-scale rebellion, the largest and most dangerous of her reign. The spark came in the most unlikely form, a charismatic Cossack named Yemelyan Pugachev, who claimed to be none other than Peter III, Catherine's deposed and allegedly murdered husband. Although Peter had been dead for nearly a decade, many Russians in the countryside still revered him, or at least despised Catherine enough to believe he might have returned. Pugachev, seizing this myth, rallied discontented Cossacks, serfs, and old believers to his cause. In their eyes, Catherine was the foreign-born empress who had betrayed the Russian soul. Pugachev offered a different vision, one of a just Tsar, liberator of the peasants, and defender of the Orthodox faith. In 1773, Pugachev's rebellion exploded along the Volga River like wildfire through dry grass. At its height, Pugachev commanded an army of tens of thousands, Cossacks, runaway serfs, minor nobles, and religious dissenters. They stormed forts, overran towns, and executed landlords and imperial officials. Their grievances were deeply rooted. Serfdom had become more brutal under Catherine's rule, despite her Enlightenment ideals. Nobles had been granted greater control over their serfs in exchange for political loyalty, while the peasantry sank deeper into poverty and despair. To Catherine, this was no mere band of rebels. This was civil war. The empress, usually calm and calculating, was deeply alarmed. The rebellion revealed a fragile truth. While her reforms dazzled the elite and her military conquests impressed Europe, her empire's foundation, the serfs who worked the land, was crumbling beneath her. Worse still, the idea that Pugachev could be believed as Peter III exposed a dangerous vulnerability in her legitimacy. She had taken the crown from her husband, and now someone claiming to be him was using that history against her. Catherine moved swiftly and decisively. She dispatched elite regiments under the command of experienced generals, including Alexander Suvorov, one of the greatest military minds of the century. Her strategy was not just to crush the rebellion, but to make an example of it, to send a message that the empress's authority would not be questioned, no matter how far from St. Petersburg the flames of discontent burned. The campaign was brutal. Entire villages suspected of aiding the rebels were burned to the ground. Thousands were executed. Pugachev, once hailed as a folk hero, was eventually betrayed by his own men, captured, and brought to Moscow in an iron cage. In 1775, he was publicly beheaded and quartered, his body displayed as a grim warning. Catherine had put down the rebellion, but the scars remained. The Pugachev rebellion marked a turning point in her reign. She realized that the very ideals she admired in the Enlightenment, liberty, equality, justice, were often incompatible with the autocracy required to hold Russia together. After the uprising, she became far more cautious about reform, especially when it came to the peasantry. She abandoned earlier plans to abolish serfdom and instead tightened noble control over rural lands and labor. Russia's vast distances, ethnic diversity, and deep social divides made liberal reform a dangerous gamble. Privately, Catherine was shaken. The rebellion had shown her the limits of imperial vision in a land as volatile and divided as Russia. She no longer saw herself as merely a philosopher queen. She was now, unambiguously, a sovereign of steel, forced to rule not just through reason but through force. Publicly, however, she turned the victory into a political triumph. She rebranded the rebellion as a victory for order and civilization over barbarism and chaos. Pugachev was painted as a lunatic and criminal. The Russian press, tightly controlled by the state, published official accounts emphasizing Catherine's wisdom and leadership. To her fellow monarchs in Europe, she appeared not as a woman in peril but as a ruler who had passed her ultimate test. Yet among the people, especially the peasants, the legend of Pugachev lived on. For years, stories of the false Tsar circulated in rural villages. To some, he was a villain. To others, he remained a symbol of hope, proof that resistance was possible, however fleeting. Catherine, despite her brilliance, never fully regained the trust of the peasantry. Her empire endured, but it stood on a foundation more brittle than it appeared. In many ways, Pugachev's rebellion exposed the contradictions of Catherine's reign, an empress inspired by Enlightenment ideals, ruling over a society mired in feudalism, a woman celebrated for culture and progress, forced to wield violence to maintain control. It was a paradox that would define her rule, and Russia's destiny. Catherine the Great, the weight of legacy. By the time Catherine the Great passed away in 1796, she had ruled the Russian Empire for more than 3 transformative decades. Few monarchs in history, let alone female monarchs in a male-dominated world, left behind a legacy as vast, complicated, and enduring as hers. She had risen from an obscure German princess to one of the most powerful women in world history. But her reign left behind not just palaces and victories, it left paradoxes that still echo in the soul of Russia today. When Catherine ascended the throne in 1762, Russia was a sprawling but chaotic empire, geographically massive, politically backward, and economically fragmented. By the time of her death, it was a dominant European power, with expanded borders, a centralized monarchy, and a growing cultural identity that rivaled the courts of Paris and Vienna. She had succeeded in reshaping Russia's image abroad. European leaders once dismissed Russia as a distant, icy autocracy. Catherine changed that perception. Under her rule, Russia became fashionable. Foreign dignitaries visited her court not out of obligation, but out of awe. She corresponded with Enlightenment giants like Voltaire, Diderot, and Montesquieu, not as a student, but as a peer. She invited artists, architects, and scholars to St. Petersburg, and her reign sparked a cultural flowering across the empire. One of her most celebrated achievements was the founding and expansion of the Hermitage Museum, which began as her personal art collection and grew into one of the world's premier cultural institutions. She believed that a ruler must not only conquer territories, but also elevate minds. She sponsored the construction of libraries, academies, and schools, and she championed education for girls, a radical idea at the time. But Catherine's legacy was more than culture and correspondence. It was built on power, hard power. She had expanded Russia's territory through military conquests, defeating the Ottoman Empire and seizing control of Crimea. She had participated in the partitions of Poland, a move that extended Russia's influence deep into Central Europe. With each new acquisition, she solidified Russia's status as a global player. Her geopolitical instincts were as sharp as any general's sword. Yet, her success came with profound contradictions. For all her admiration of Enlightenment ideals, Catherine did not liberate the serfs. In fact, she did the opposite. Under her reign, serfdom became more entrenched. In exchange for the loyalty of the nobility, whose support she relied on to maintain power, Catherine granted them greater control over their lands and the peasants who worked them. Serfs were sold, beaten, and inherited like livestock, while the nobility flourished. It was a bitter irony. The empress who read Rousseau by candlelight kept millions in bondage. To her credit, Catherine understood this contradiction. She even considered freeing the serfs at various points. But after events like the Pugachev rebellion, she became convinced that such a move would destabilize the empire. Her top priority was always order and unity, even if it came at the cost of justice. Her treatment of the nobility further reveals her pragmatism. While some European monarchs clashed with their aristocrats, Catherine mastered the art of manipulation. She rewarded loyalty, punished treason, and kept her court in a delicate state of dependency. She used titles, estates, and flattery as weapons of statecraft. She understood the psychology of power, not just how to take it, but how to keep it. Despite her many lovers and scandals, her rule never wavered. Her personal life often made headlines, but it never undermined her authority. In fact, many of her closest romantic partners, like Gregory Potemkin, played crucial roles in military strategy and internal governance. She surrounded herself with talent, not sycophants. In her final years, Catherine attempted one last grand project, to reform the Russian legal code. She had long believed that the law should be rational, consistent, and humane. She organized commissions and wrote outlines for reform, but the complexity of Russia, and the resistance of the aristocracy, kept the project unfinished. Still, the effort showed her enduring belief in progress. When she died at age 67, Catherine left behind a transformed empire. St. Petersburg had become a beacon of Enlightenment culture. Russian literature, philosophy, and art were beginning to find their voices. The military was respected and feared. The empire's borders stretched farther than ever before. But the foundations of this greatness, serfdom, inequality, and autocracy, would also lay the groundwork for future revolutions. History judges Catherine the Great with both admiration and caution. Her achievements are undeniable. She made Russia stronger, richer, and more connected to Europe. She proved that a woman could not only rule, but dominate in a world of kings and emperors. She brought art, ideas, and education to a land long neglected by Western intellectuals. But she also left behind a system that would one day collapse under its own contradictions. She is remembered not just as a monarch, but as a mirror of her time, ambitious, brilliant, flawed, and fiercely committed to power. For all her letters to philosophers and paintings in palaces, she was, at heart, a ruler who believed in the strength of the state above all else. Catherine earned her title, the Great, not by being perfect, but by being unforgettable, a woman who shaped the fate of an empire with intelligence, charisma, and an iron will. Catherine the Great, an extraordinary woman in a man's world. Catherine the Great's story is not just a tale of political conquest or cultural transformation, it is the story of an extraordinary woman who rose above the expectations and limitations of her time. Born far from the Russian throne, she navigated a treacherous path in a world dominated by men, where power was often measured by birthright and brute force. Catherine defied all odds and carved out her place in history through a combination of intelligence, strategy, resilience, and relentless ambition. Her journey began as Sophie Friederike August von Anhalt-Zerbst, a minor German princess with little initial promise of greatness. Yet, from an early age, Catherine displayed remarkable qualities. She was intellectually curious, eager to learn, and possessed a sharp political instinct. When she was selected to marry the heir to the Russian throne, Crown Prince Peter, she seized the opportunity not simply as a dutiful wife but as a future ruler in the making. Adjusting to life in Russia was no small feat. Catherine mastered the Russian language and immersed herself in the culture with determination and grace. She understood that to survive, and ultimately thrive, in the Russian court, she would have to outwit, outmaneuver, and outlast rivals. Her marriage to Peter was fraught with challenges. Peter was immature, volatile, and deeply unpopular, which put Catherine in a precarious position. But rather than succumb to despair, she quietly built alliances with the military and influential nobles, cultivating a network of support that would prove essential for her eventual rise to power. Catherine's ability to navigate the perilous dynamics of the royal court showcased her political savvy. The Russian court was rife with intrigue, suspicion, and danger. Many would have been overwhelmed by such an environment, but Catherine thrived. She exercised patience and caution, learning when to assert herself and when to hold back. Her personal charm, combined with calculated displays of strength, enabled her to build trust and loyalty among powerful factions. Her intellectual pursuits also set her apart. Catherine was deeply influenced by the Enlightenment, a movement that celebrated reason, progress, and individual rights. She corresponded with leading philosophers of the day, absorbing their ideas and envisioning how Russia could be modernized. Yet, she never blindly adopted Western ideals. Catherine was pragmatic. She understood that reforms had to be balanced with the realities of Russian society and the power of the nobility. Her approach was a delicate dance between innovation and tradition. When the opportunity arose in 1762, Catherine acted decisively. The coup that brought her to the throne was nearly bloodless but required meticulous planning and timing. Her ability to seize power was not a moment of luck but the result of years of preparation, alliance building, and strategic thinking. Once empress, she ruled with confidence, keen intellect, and an awareness of the delicate balance she had to maintain. Her reign was marked by ambitious reforms and bold expansion, but also by the harsh realities of maintaining autocratic control. Catherine was no idealist. She was a ruler who understood that the stability of her empire depended on power, order, and control. This meant confronting uprisings like the Pugachev rebellion with brutal force and preserving the system of serfdom that bound millions of Russians. Through it all, Catherine worked tirelessly to cultivate her image as a strong, enlightened monarch. She commissioned portraits, sponsored grand architectural projects, and cultivated a court culture that emphasized sophistication and learning. This carefully crafted image was not mere vanity, it was a political tool that reinforced her authority and legitimacy in the eyes of both her subjects and foreign powers. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Catherine's story is how she broke the mold of what a woman in her era could achieve. She was a ruler in a world where kings and emperors ruled supreme, and where women were often relegated to the sidelines. Yet, Catherine held power with a combination of firmness and finesse, proving that leadership transcends gender. Her legacy as a powerful woman endures because she was more than just a figurehead. She was a visionary and a pragmatist, a reformer and a conqueror. She understood the complexities of ruling a vast and diverse empire and wielded her influence to shape the course of Russian history in profound ways. Catherine the Great's life is a testament to the power of intellect, determination, and strategic vision. She remains an inspiration not only for the extraordinary woman she was but also for anyone who seeks to overcome barriers and redefine what is possible. Thanks for joining me on Thunga's Storytime as we unravel the extraordinary life of Catherine the Great, a woman who defied all odds to rule one of the world's greatest empires. If you love this deep dive into history's most powerful figures, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story that will surprise and inspire you. There's so much more fascinating history waiting to be told, and I want you to be the first to hear it. Drop a comment below with which historical figure you want to explore next. Until next time, keep your curiosity alive and your stories bold. See you soon.